Texas has spent years challenging the federal government, so why not fight a recent lawsuit ending in-state tuition for undocumented students? Details on The Standard.
Texas Standard is a production of KUT Austin, KERA North Texas, Houston Public Media, and Texas Public Radio in San Antonio.
I'm Angela Cocheraga in El Paso. Other stories we're tracking: DNA testing to solve abandoned baby doe cold cases. Decades later, mothers face charges. And a new book recounts the time the author spent in a U.S. detention camp for children in Texas when he was 14. Plus, why Texas won't mandate a tool that prevents companies from hiring undocumented workers. Also, why customers are using buy now, pay later services, not just for big ticket items, but basic necessities. All that and more on today's Texas Standard. No matter where you are, it's Texas Standard Time on this 10th day of June 2025. So glad you can join us. I'm Angela Cocheraga in El Paso. Texas has touted its effort to crack down on illegal immigration, especially on the border. As a longtime journalist covering immigration, I've talked to many migrants on the border in Mexico and Central America. And a top reason for setting off for the U.S. is a job. And they tell me they have no doubt someone will hire them. And often they know exactly which employer, often in Texas. So why doesn't the state require private companies to use the so-called E-Verify system? That's a tool to prevent companies from hiring undocumented workers. We'll delve into this a little bit later. But first, Texas has spent years fighting for states' rights in lawsuit after lawsuit challenging the Biden administration. But the state quickly gave in when recently faced with a lawsuit from the Trump administration, forcing Texas to end in-state tuition for undocumented students. So what happened? For more, we're joined by Eleanor Klibanoff, who reported on this issue for the Texas Tribune. Eleanor, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Well, walk us through the timeline here.
Sure. So, the federal government announced in about midday on last Wednesday, that they were suing Texas, which was pretty surprising considering sort of the friendly relationship between the Trump administration and Texas. They were suing over this law that says undocumented students can get in-state tuition. This came about 2 days after the legislature gavelled out without changing this law. So lawsuits announced. About 6 hours later, Texas announces they have agreed to a consent judgment that says the law will no longer be enforced in Texas, which is a pretty whirlwind timeline to get a federal court case resolved, which certainly raised some questions for legal experts.
Well, so my understanding that this move by Texas is somewhat unusual. What did critics have to say about it?
Certainly, groups that work with undocumented students that have been receiving this in-state tuition are very concerned about what this will mean for, those students as they prepare for the fall semester. But for legal experts, this case raises a whole separate set of issues about whether the federal government and Texas should really be working so closely on a case like this. The Supreme Court has long held that you really can't bring friendly suits where you just ask someone to sort of sue so that you can get the outcome that you want. And there's a lot of worry that this would sort of qualify as a friendly suit or what's sometimes called a collusive lawsuit, which typically, a judge would not grant. In this case, obviously a judge did. But just a lot of questions about how this came to be and what it sort of means about, what the Texas Office of the Attorney General and the federal government see as their roles next to the Texas legislature.
So who would have been involved in state government in the decision, and has the state made any public comments about this?
There's largely been celebration about this ruling from state officials. We heard from Attorney General Ken Paxton, whose office negotiated this agreement, if you will, saying, that they worked closely with the Department of Justice on this. They welcomed this. Governor Greg Abbott echoed that, as well as the state lawmakers who brought these bills that failed to repeal this policy, really celebrating this as a win to get this law that they are opposed to off the books. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of Texas has done a lot to try to defend its states' rights from this sort of federal intrusion. And so to see this reversal, a lot of sort of legal experts and political scientists are are raising their eyebrows at that.
So what does this mean for students who have suddenly had their in-state tuition status changed?
Students are really grappling with that and trying to figure out what this does mean for them. I think, we've heard from universities, it seems like, people who are currently in like a summer semester, those are, they can sort of maintain their in-state tuition. But going forward, what could be up to 19,000 students are suddenly learning that they're going to have to potentially pay the out-of-state tuition, which is significantly higher. And there's not really a clear legal path at this time to challenge this, although we have heard from some groups that are trying to find a way to kind of get in and reverse this ruling if they can.
So these students are Texas residents who graduated from Texas high schools?
Right. The law that's been on the books since 2001 says that, you can qualify for in-state tuition if you have lived in Texas at least 3 years and have graduated from a Texas high school. So when this passed, the idea was federal law says we have to pay for undocumented students to get K through 12 education in our public schools. We're getting these students to, we're paying all the way through for them to go K through 12. Why wouldn't we want them to go to university if they are able to, if they qualify? So let's make that easier for them. Let's make sure these students are getting educated, and then per the affidavit, as soon as they are able, they're becoming U.S. citizens, contributing to the economy of Texas, versus sort of making it harder for them to go to college or university at the end of their high school experience. So these are students who have lived in Texas at least 3 years and graduated from Texas high schools.
We've been speaking to Eleanor Klibanoff, who reports for the Texas Tribune. Eleanor, thank you again for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Houston City Council has approved Mayor John Whitmire's $7 billion budget for the 2026 fiscal year, which starts in July. Houston Public Media's Dominic Anthony Walsh reports the passage came in the face of protests last week.
Protesters made their voices heard in the council chambers last week before police forcefully cleared the room.
Do not touch me, man.
Their frustration stemmed from the city's spending on streets and drainage.
Our infrastructure here in Houston is pretty bad.
Andrew Barley is co-director of West Street Recovery, one of the groups involved in the protest.
We are not okay with the mayor's budget going into the next year. We feel that there's been a misspending of drainage tax dollars.
Their big problem with the budget was also a major victory for Whitmire's administration. In April, he struck a settlement in a long-standing lawsuit over voter-mandated spending on streets and drainage. Under the agreement, the city will ramp up spending over the next 3 years. It saves the city about $180 million over the next year. Unlike the protesters, Bob Jones, one of the plaintiffs who sued the city for shortchanging the fund, supported that settlement.
What he has offered is a very fair arrangement for the next 2 years.
The agreement also staved off an implosion of the city's finances. The 2025 deficit was the largest in city history, more than $330 million. The settlement cut that gap by about a third. Even with the savings, most departments saw significant cuts as the administration whittled down next year's deficit to about $62 million.
We were told we couldn't do it, we couldn't balance it.
Whitmire says he's proud of the budget, especially efficiency initiatives that could save the city millions by fixing bloated contracts with outside vendors.
This is a giant step, but we need to now talk to Houstonians going forward about what type city they want to live in.
What type of city they want to live in. How do you hear that? Is that forecasting or foreshadowing a potential property tax hike?
Well, I think that's a very pragmatic question.
Renee Cross directs the University of Houston's Hobby School of Public Affairs.
At some point, residents, voters will have to determine, do we want to continue to have problems, say, getting our trash picked up?
Without a major increase in revenue, most departments saw cuts, as the administration slashed a total of $122 million in spending. According to department presentations in May, solid waste, parks, libraries, and health each saw cuts ranging from $2 million to more than $6 million. That led to some dissent last week.
Please call the roll, Mr. Secretary.
Mayor Whitmire,
Yes.
3 of the 16 council members voted no on the budget.
Councilmember Kamen,
No.
Councilmember Thomas.
No.
Councilmember Pollard.
No.
Councilmember Cassidy.
My resistance to supporting the budget really lies between the workforce reduction and the financial cuts to the department.
That's Councilmember Tiffany Thomas.
The demand of our city, the demand of the services is not minimizing. That's what gives me pause in terms of how we move forward.
Because of a recently approved 5-year, $832 million contract with the police union, HPD is one of the few departments that will see an increase over the next year, to the tune of $67 million. At the press conference before the protest, West Street organizer Andrew Barley paraphrased a recent Houston Chronicle opinion piece. It criticizes the proportion of city spending on police and fire, about 60% of the $3 billion general fund.
We're living in a house that's crumbling. We don't even have a bed, but are spending all of our money to pay for a violent alarm system.
I'm Dominic Anthony Walsh in Houston.
Our social media editor, Wells Dunbar, joins us now with what Texans are talking about. Hi, Wells.
Hi, Angela. Great to be with you. Another day of protest in Texas following escalation of ICE actions snatching immigrants off the streets. Following protests in Houston and San Antonio last night, Austin saw a large and largely peaceful protest calling for ICE to stop its actions targeting undocumented migrants. Galvanizing the opposition, President Trump's deployal of National Guard troops in California over the objection of Golden State leadership. And despite a night of largely muted and non-violent protest in Los Angeles, Trump ordering some 700 Marines to LA. On our Facebook page, Robert Flood says, if one studies the history of the battle between states' rights and federal oversight, one would conclude that federal oversight rules. But if Trump keeps placing the National Guard in more so-called sanctuary cities, I believe the Supreme Court will need to rein in his actions. And Gwen McDonald, also via Facebook, says, I was just following orders, was not a legal defense at Nuremberg, and won't be here either. Any member of the armed forces who violates the Constitution they swore to uphold and follows orders to make war on our citizens should and will be held accountable. Interesting perspectives there, Angela, and just a couple of the perspectives we're seeing this Tuesday. I'll be back with more later in the program.
Yeah, thank you, Wells. Coming up, we hear from a 14-year-old about his time in a migrant detention camp for children. There's more Texas Standard just ahead.
Support for Texas Standard comes from HEB and the My HEB app, which is available for download, and shopping fresh departments like seafood, produce, bakery, and deli, and scheduling curbside pickup or home delivery. More at HEB.com. Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas College Savings Plan, administered by the state of Texas. Families can save for tuition, room and board, books, and other qualified education expenses at eligible schools nationwide. Learn more at texascollegesavings.com.
This is a Texas Standard. I'm Angela Kocherga. The head of the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services has announced she'll leave the position at the end of July. Commissioner Stephanie Muth has been with the department since January of 2023. Texas Public Radio's Paul Flav reports.
Muth inherited a department filled with problems, high turnover, massive backlogs in child protection investigations, high numbers of foster children in hotel rooms without placements, and a federal judge keeping the department on a short leash. Since she took the reins, turnover has fallen somewhat, backlogs and investigations were cut dramatically, and the number of children without placements has evaporated. The state's legal team also managed to have the federal judge replaced. DFPS has also celebrated the drop in abuse and neglect fatalities, but journalists and child welfare advocates have shown the drop is largely the result of changes to how the state counts those deaths and which children's deaths are investigated. I'm Paul Flav in San Antonio.
And you're listening to the Texas Standard. I'm Laura Rice. If you've bought something online, you've probably seen an option at checkout to split the cost of your purchase into installments, often with a service called Klarna. Increasingly, American consumers are using these buy now, pay later options for more than just big ticket items like television and vacations. They're using them for groceries too. Julie Creswell reports on business and food for the New York Times. Julie, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, talk to me. How did you find out that people were using services like Klarna for groceries?
So it was a data point. I had somebody came through LendingTree, came through with a data point on a survey they had done, and buried sort of within this survey was this point that 24% of the people that were using these buy now, pay later loans were using them to buy groceries. And that was up really sharply from 14% a year ago. And so I started looking at that and thinking about that and wondering, was this an indicator of like how financially stretched some consumers have been? Or is this an indicator of an industry that is rapidly expanding in the United States? And I think the answer is both.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you exactly that. I mean, there's no denying that food prices have gone up. That was a huge part of the November election. It's something that people talk about regularly, not just egg prices, food prices in general. Is that something you heard when you reached out to people about this?
Absolutely. When you just look again at the data, since 2019, food prices, food at home, is about 30% more than what it was. And I think any of us that go into the grocery stores feel like every time, our cart just gets more and more expensive. And so definitely we heard from people that were saying that it was becoming more expensive to just go grocery shopping. And so they were looking for ways to split those payments up or to break up their grocery store bill so that they could kind of, smooth out their money spending activities.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is there a downside to this, though? I mean, Klarna really touts its no interest payment plans, but what are the risks?
The risks are that you can get several of these loans at once, I think, are one of the biggest risks. It's a process called loan stacking, in which maybe I've got, I bought groceries on Tuesday from Klarna for $400. Now that's getting split up. And then I go to Best Buy and I bought a new headphone. And I'm going to split that payment up. And then a couple days later, I go and I buy some shoes at Nike, and I'm going to split that payment up. These programs, when you apply for the credit, you connect it immediately to your auto pay on your bank account, and so those payments are going to come out. They're going to just disappear. They're going to be taken out of your bank account. So like one of the women that I spoke to in the story who had kind of gone on some major sprees using these programs, opened up her bank account one day and just saw, withdrawal. And it basically was slowly draining her bank account. So I think the trick is it's so easy to do, and it seems so attractive that if you get caught in sort of this trap of signing up for like multiple accounts for multiple purchases, you might actually not be tracking that and having your bank account get drained.
Did you hear from economic experts? What did they say about, I guess, what this trend says about American consumers?
I think a lot of them, again, sort of say what we're hearing from not only, economists and analysts, but even when you hear and talk to Wall Street chiefs or, heads of businesses right now, is we're really watching that low income consumer. They are reducing or changing their spending patterns very, very rapidly, whether it's, how much they're spending at McDonald's or how much they're spending on, Frito-Lay chips in the grocery store. That's changing. And these are the customers that are the biggest users of these buy now, pay later loans. And I think that's what's concerning to analysts, is it's an indication for them that that segment of the American population, people who are with household incomes of $25,000 or less or $50,000 or less, is struggling to meet daily essential needs.
So a lot of consumers are using these options as an alternative to racking up credit card debt. On one hand, there's a benefit to that because credit card debt, if you carry a balance, that obviously can add up very quickly. But at the same time, if you're using a credit card, you're building credit, and these loans sort of operate outside of that. Is that something that you've looked into as well or heard from folks?
It came up a lot in my reporting, and you're exactly right. I mean, some of the people that I spoke to had literally thousands of dollars on credit card debt, and at interest rates that were 27, 30, 32%. So the last thing they wanted to do was to put groceries or something like that on a credit card with that sort of high bearing interest rate on it. So that was one of the reasons that they liked these, zero interest loans as well. And they're very protective of these loans. They're going to pay these bills off before they even pay some of their other bills off, because they don't want to lose access to this low or zero interest rate loan. So yeah, that definitely came up a lot, but also, and there's a little bit of a mix in the industry. Some of the companies actually do report to the credit bureaus. Affirm, I believe, once you take the loan out, do report it. But there are definitely people that are concerned out there about what this could mean for other lenders. Mortgage lenders, for instance, are definitely going to look at your bank account. And if they see withdrawal, they're going to know what you've been doing. They'll be able to figure that out. But maybe a car lender may not necessarily see what your total debt picture looks like, because there's little transparency with these companies and these loans, and how much I may actually have in, debt to these companies. So I think there's a couple different things going on for sure.
Julie Creswell reports on business and food for the New York Times. Julie, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Support for Texas Standard comes from the beef-loving Texans at the Texas Beef Council, a community passionate about what they eat, where it comes from, and how it's prepared. Recipes and meal ideas at beeflovingtexans.com.
It's not just about the brisket or the ribs or the sausage or even the sides. It's the culture and people who are passionate about it. Where there's smoke, there's Daniel Vaughn, Texas Monthly Barbecue Editor. Make sure to join us Thursday on the Texas Standard.
Support for Where There's Smoke comes from HEB.
From the Texas Newsroom, I'm Alexandra Hart. Protesters have taken to the streets in Austin and Dallas. Hundreds rallied near the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge in Dallas last night in opposition to the federal immigration crackdown. There were some skirmishes between protesters and police officers carrying riot shields. The crowd was ordered to disperse around 11 o'clock or face being arrested. A similar event took place in downtown Austin, with law enforcement officers using an eye irritant to disperse crowds. Hundreds of demonstrators gathered at the Texas Capitol building. Several made their way to the J.J. Pickle Federal Building, which has reportedly been used as a holding facility for detained immigrants. Protesters were met by Austin PD and state troopers.
You are ordered to disperse out of the area immediately to the north on Sanjack. If you do not disperse, you may be subject to arrest and/or less legal action.
Governor Abbott posted on social media that more than a dozen people were arrested at the Austin protest. A federal judge ruled Monday that the Trump administration acted unlawfully when it used a wartime act to deport Venezuelan immigrants. The Trump administration invoked the 18th Century Alien Enemies Act earlier this year in response to suspected threats of the Venezuelan Tren de Aragua gang. The judge ruled that the president cannot unilaterally define and declare a so-called invasion and needs to address border security through laws passed by Congress. One of San Antonio's longest-serving mayors, Ron Nirenberg, officially bid the city farewell as its leader on Monday during a speech in council chambers. Texas Public Radio's Brian Kirkpatrick reports.
Nirenberg told those gathered in the chambers that poverty and crime are down, affordable housing is up, and great jobs are up too. But he says there's more work to be done. He urged San Antonians to continue to lift up themselves and their fellow residents. He thanked city leaders, calling City Manager Eric Walsh the best in the nation. He thanked first responders and the rest of the city's 13,000 employees. But it was a personal speech, too. He thanked his wife for showing her own passion for the city.
But even as mayor of the 7th largest city in the United States for the last 8 years, every day I'm still the 24-year-old newlywed trying to make his wife proud when he gets home.
And he thanked all San Antonians for allowing him to serve as their mayor these past 8 years. Gina Ortiz-Jones will be sworn in as the new mayor on June 18th. I'm Brian Kirkpatrick in San Antonio.
Support for these Texas headlines comes from Aspire Allergy and Sinus, providing same-day results and custom treatment plans to tackle allergies at the root of the problem. Over 40 locations throughout Texas. More info at aspireallergy.com.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm Angela Kocherga. The year was 2004, and a landowner in Medina County, west of San Antonio, made a grisly discovery: the body of a newborn infant girl abandoned near the fence line. It took nearly 2 decades to identify the mother. In recent years, improvements in genetic genealogy have allowed investigators to find the women who gave birth to the so-called baby does. That's led to solving cold cases and sometimes, decades later, significant jail time for the mothers. Isabel Taft wrote about the technology for the New York Times. Isabel, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, your reporting centers on this case in Medina County, Texas. Tell us what happened.
So after the baby was discovered in 2004, the Medina County Sheriff's Office invested a lot of time and resources into trying to identify the baby's mother, trying to solve the crime. They were, from the beginning, convinced that the baby had been born alive, that they were investigating a homicide. The basis for that was a pretty controversial technique called the lung float test, which is widely regarded as not accurate. So today there are some questions about whether the baby actually was born alive. But police knocked doors all up and down the road. They talked to everybody they could think of. They collected DNA samples from county fair workers who had been in town at the time. They even staked out the cemetery where the baby was born on the anniversary of her death, thinking, maybe someone would come by and they could question that person. But the case went totally cold until a few years ago. Some of the investigators decided to try to use this new technique, forensic investigative genetic genealogy, and that was ultimately what enabled them to identify the baby's mother and eventually charge her with murder.
Well, tell us how the DNA testing works and how common is it?
So the way it works, unlike traditional DNA testing, where you need to get a direct match in the federal database of DNA, which is called CODIS, you need to have a direct match from the suspect. They have to already be in that database. With forensic genetic genealogy, you can start with any sort of sample, and you plug it into commercial DNA databases, and you might identify, say, a second or third cousin of the victim. The police in these cases may start with a distant array of cousins, and then they use genetic genealogy techniques, or really just genealogy techniques, including public records, census data, newspaper clips, that kind of thing, to trace out the family tree. And then they can use that process to eventually zero in on who is the baby's mother. And since it first became prominent after 2018, it had been used to solve more than 700 cold case homicides and sexual assault cases. So that's not just baby doe cases.
Right.
I found that it had been used to solve roughly 40 baby doe cases. It's not terribly common, but it is increasingly used.
Yeah, still a significant number. Do we know what happened to the women and why did they abandon the babies? I'm sure there are different reasons, but why didn't they look for other options to surrender the babies?
So in terms of the legal outcomes, there is a really wide range. Some women have been charged with murder, convicted, sentenced to decades in prison. Other women, after law enforcement identify them, law enforcement concludes that they do not have enough evidence to charge the woman with murder, and the statute of limitations has passed for other charges, and so the woman is not charged at all. And in terms of why women did not take other avenues to surrender them, I think we really tend to overestimate, first of all, how well known things like the safe haven boxes are. The Washington Post did some great reporting out of Texas about how in Texas, the state has really not funded any kind of public awareness campaign. So, people don't know that this is an option. But another factor is that many of these women told police that they did not know that they were pregnant. And so by the time they go into labor, they had not gone through any kind of, mental preparation to think about what they would do in that moment. And then many of them said the baby was not born alive, that they believed the baby had been stillborn. And there are a lot of questions, of course, around what actually happened, but the forensic science that we have generally is not very reliable at determining whether, a baby was born alive or was not born alive.
We'll link to Isabel Taft's reporting for the New York Times at texasstandard.org. Isabel, thank you again.
Thank you so much for your interest in the story. I really appreciate it.
Support for Texas Standard comes from UT Austin's LBJ School of Public Affairs, announcing its new Master of National Security degree. Applications for 2026 open on September 1st. Information at lbj.utexas.edu/national security. Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Mutual Insurance Company, a workers' compensation provider committed to helping Texas communities and emphasizing safety. More at texasmutual.com/TexansGetIt.
This is the Texas Standard. I'm Angela Kocherga. The effort to carry out mass deportations in this country right now is unprecedented. The call for immigration reform has persisted for decades and includes voices from both sides of the political aisle. Often the people affected by immigration policies created in Washington are left out of the discussion or debate. It's extremely rare to hear the voices of children caught up in the crackdown. A new memoir provides some insight into the 5 months a then 14-year-old boy who goes by D. Esperanza spent at the Tornillo detention facility in El Paso. That's where Gerardo Ivan Morales met the teen while providing support at the tent facility. Together, they co-wrote the book Detained, A Boy's Journal of Survival and Resilience. Bienvenidos, D. and Ivan. Thanks for joining us on the Texas Standard.
Thank you so much for having us today.
Well, let's start with D. Tell us, what was it like in the Tornillo holding camp? Cuéntanos cómo era tu vida ahí en Tornillo.
Puedo hacer una comparación de que le puedes preguntar a una persona que estuvo en prisión.
I can do a comparison if you were to ask somebody that had been locked up in prison.
Y puedo decir que fue igual.
And I can say that it was the same.
Solo que en este caso éramos niños.
Just in this case, we were children.
Nos trataban como tales, ellos nos miraban como criminales.
They treated us as if we were criminals.
Nos amenazaban con ser deportados.
They would threaten us that we would be reported and deported.
Si jugábamos, si hablábamos, si simplemente éramos niños.
If we talked, if we played together, if we were just simply being kids.
A veces necesitamos como salir, ir al baño, o necesitamos ver al doctor, nos dolía algo. Ellos nos decían, no, cállate o si no serás deportado.
Sometimes we would need to leave the tent to either use the restroom or because we weren't feeling well, we needed to go see medical. And they would tell us, no, be quiet or you will get deported.
Gracias. So, Ivan, how did you meet Dee?
I had the honor and privilege of meeting D. Esperanza inside of the Tornillo Detention Center. I spent 6 months inside of the detention center as an immigrant myself, and as a DACA recipient, I am very passionate about immigration and human rights. And when that summer in 2018, where the news was covering reports of kids in cages and the horrific family separations, as soon as I saw that there was a Texas tent city, I needed to figure out what I needed to do so I could be there and provide aid for my immigrant community.
So just to understand, were you volunteering or did you happen to work at the facility back
I
then?
worked at the facility. And so when I found out that there were detaining children, I did my research on how I could get involved. And the Office of Refugee and Resettlement partners with Health and Human Services, and they contract a nonprofit organization to house these children while they're being detained. And so I found out that they do contracting agencies to hire to be with direct care as with the children. And so I was a direct care worker as a emergency reservist for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And my experience, I compare it to similar to the foster care system, where we know it's a very broken system. We know there's negligence. But if you could be that one social worker that could change the life of a child there, even save the life of a child, then it's worth it. And so for me, I never questioned my decision to be there because I needed to be there directly with these children to be an advocate and to provide that aid for anything and stand up for any injustices that I saw.
So for Dee, why did you want to keep a diary, both when you set off for the U.S. and migrated north and later when you were detained? Entonces, ¿por qué escribiste tu diario cuando migraste y después cuando estuviste encerrado en Tornillo? Y si quiere agregar también, ¿por qué compartir esta experiencia? ¿Tenías dudas?
Escribí en el centro porque fue la única manera que tuve para liberarme. Fue la única manera que tuve para poder sacar todo lo que yo tenía dentro.
I wrote while being detained because it was the only way for me to free myself, to liberate what I was feeling inside. It was a way for me to process my emotion.
Tenía una cantidad enorme de estrés allá adentro, siendo un niño de 13 años, una cantidad de miedo, de inseguridad.
I had a huge fear of being there. I had an incredible fear of being detained at only 13 years old.
Mucha confusión porque las personas me trataban así.
A lot of confusion on why people were treating me this way.
Escribir para mí fue una forma de liberación.
Writing for me was a way of liberation.
Y mostrárselo a Iván fue tan especial para mí.
And showing it to Ivan was extremely special for me.
Una persona que nos ayudó mucho a todos los niños allá adentro.
A person who helped us while being detained, helped all the children while being detained.
Y puedo llegar a decir que fue Iván el que me motivó a seguir escribiendo más.
And I can honestly say that Ivan was the one who encouraged and motivated me to continue writing more.
Muchísimas gracias. So, Ivan, what has writing this book meant for you? And can you talk about some reaction? I know it hasn't been out that long, but what is the reaction you're getting?
My role in this project as the co-author, I only have a note at the end of Detained. So Detained is the first ever memoir written by a child. De Esperanza wrote this entire story inside his composition notebook. And Detained, A Boy's Journal of Survival and Resilience, is a direct English translation of that entire story. And so you will meet me as a character when De Esperanza meets me and writes about it. I am a witness. I was there with him. I was there while he was being detained throughout his 5 months. This is truly De Esperanza's entire story. You do get an epilogue, which he wrote now as an adult, which catches you up on where he is currently in his life. But I really, truly saw my role in this as just an advocate and somebody who would just navigate this entire publishing process and figure out how we can get this story published.
Well, finally, for Dee, what message do you have for other children or teens coping with this situation, including family separation during an immigration crackdown? ¿Qué mensaje tienes para otros niños o adolescentes que enfrentan este tipo de situación?
Lo que me mantuvo firme a mí fue la esperanza.
What maintained me firm there was hope.
Fue la fe.
It was faith.
Y sobre todo la unión.
And Most importantly, unity.
La unión que llegas a formar con los demás niños allá adentro.
The unity that you form with the other children that are also detained.
Porque ellos se convierten en tu familia.
Because they become your family.
Nunca perder la fe y siempre tener esperanza.
Never lose your faith and always have hope.
We've been speaking to Di Esperanza and Gerardo Ivan Morales, co-authors of the book Detained, a Boy's Journal of Survival and Resilience. Muchísimas gracias, Di and Ivan. Thank you both for speaking with us.
Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Support for Texas Standard comes from St. Edward's University graduate programs in business, leadership, analytics, counseling, and nursing. Flexible online, hybrid, and in-person options. More at stedwards.edu/grad 2025.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm Laura Rice. Making it difficult for migrants to enter and live in the U.S. seems to have long been a goal of some Republican leaders, including Donald Trump and Greg Abbott. Under Governor Abbott, Texas has even taken an active role in forcing migrants out, a role given by law to the federal government. But when it comes to keeping undocumented migrants out of the workforce, Texas has opted not to wield one tool that a number of states, including some led by Republicans, already use. E-Verify is a federal database that identifies whether a job seeker can work legally in the U.S., but most private employers in Texas are not required to use it. Some Texas lawmakers have tried to require E-Verify to no avail. Loemi Creel has been reporting on this for ProPublica and the Texas Tribune. Loemi, welcome back to the Texas Standard.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I said E-Verify is a database, but what is it exactly? How does it work?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty simple. It's a computer program that's been around for decades, and employers run the verification, like the Social Security card and the ID, through this program, and that authorizes pretty quickly and free that documentation is real. Now, the one problem, and a significant problem, I would add, it doesn't ever verify that those documents actually belong to that person. So that has led to this surge in the black market for people getting, documents that belong to real people. But that is a very sort of simple step that advocates say, like, okay, you can do this. Use this computer program and see if people have valid documents. And it's quite interesting that the Texas legislature for more than a decade has refused to do what really is not hard.
Interesting. So, as you mentioned, a number of bills that have gone through the legislature have kind of made it part way through, but what happened to them? Is it really this little piece here that is the problem, or is there another reason why lawmakers are sort of spiking using E-Verify?
So the interesting thing is that so much of this discussion about E-Verify in Texas is actually silence. Nobody wants to talk about it, whether that's the major industry groups. I reached out to more than a dozen of them, Texas Farm Bureau, etc. None of them would talk about it. They didn't actually testify officially for or against any of these bills. Actually, this session, there was a private mandate for all companies that made it further than any other bill previously. And it was pushed by a pretty powerful Republican Senator, Louis Kalkorist of Brenham. The bill was passed by the Senate. It just was never picked up by the House. So it sort of illustrates this growing conflict, what experts told us, between kind of the old school pro-business side of the Republican Party and those who want to be or look tougher on immigration. We don't know why it didn't make it up, through the House, but Governor Abbott also didn't clarify his current position on the bill and didn't seem to make it a priority.
What do we know about the number of workers in Texas without legal status and what kinds of jobs that they do?
It's an estimated 1.3 million Texas workers, which is more than 8% of the state's workforce, are here illegally. This is according to census data from 2023. So that number is probably higher now. But this breakdown is huge when you look at construction. About a quarter of all construction workers in Texas lack legal status. And then obviously there's agricultural, restaurant, and elder care sectors. So it seems like we all know that this is the case, that probably some of them are here illegally. And it just seems that's something that lawmakers don't just really want to deal with.
Loemi Creel is an investigative reporter for the ProPublica Texas Tribune Investigative Initiative. Loemi, thank you again.
Thank you. I appreciate this.
And you're listening to the Texas Standard.
Wells Dunbar joins us again with more of your social media comments. Hi, Wells.
Hi, Angela. Great to be back with you. Well, as I mentioned at the top of the program, tensions flaring at protests against federal immigration enforcement, drawing large crowds in Austin and also Dallas yesterday. Over there in Big D, police used pepper balls to break up crowds at the end of the demonstration. At least one person was arrested, according to a local news report. A similar story in Austin last night, where a largely peaceful protest was broken up with police force at the end of the evening. Governor Greg Abbott, amongst those paying attention, he tweeted, between the Austin Police Department and the Texas Department of Public Safety, more than a dozen protesters were arrested in Austin. Peaceful protesting is legal, he continues, but once you cross the line, you will be arrested. FAFO, or F-A-F-O, ending his tweet with that acronym. And to make the governor's tough Twitter talk a little more family appropriate, that means mess around and find out. Of course, these protests part of a growing backlash against that wave of aggressive immigration enforcement actions. And one of the flashpoints, Angela, on display in Houston, fascinating, where plainclothes ICE agents arrested 3 men at an immigration court hearing just moments after their asylum cases were dropped. This person reporting from the Houston Chronicle, and they note it's the first publicized incident of its kind in the city, although similar arrests have been reported in courtrooms across the country. I've seen that in several places. On the Houston subreddit, they're talking about this story as well. One of the top comments there reading that we as a society absolutely need to stop allowing plainclothes alleged officers to just grab people. What's stopping any random guy from kidnapping whoever they want, assuming they have the right skin tone? This is insanity, that commenter reads. And so fascinating to see how this strategy, if you will, of arresting people in court for immigration hearings is now spread to Texas. That Houston Chronicle reporting characterizing these arrests or as so-called low-hanging fruit, knowing where someone is going to be and going for them in that moment. So these protests and all the questions they raise, obviously far from over, Angela.
Courthouses, and now we heard in L.A., a Home Depot parking lot. So watch out.
Yeah, apparently, really the
day workers.
The what launched the powder keg there is this admonition from, I believe, his White House advisor Stephen Miller. Those are his exact words, saying, "Go to the Home Depot, go to the 7-Eleven." So now we're seeing how that is continuing to play out, both in California and across the country, Angela.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on it. We're out of time for today's program, but you can keep up with the news 24/7 at texasstandard.org. I'm Angela Kocherga, wishing you the very best from El Paso.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Galveston Historical Foundation, celebrating Juneteenth. As Juneteenth's birthplace, visitors can explore exhibits, tours, and events honoring the legacy of freedom all month long. More at galvestonhistory.org/Juneteenth 2025. Philanthropic support for Texas Standard comes from Casey and Scott O'Hare, the Winkler Family Foundation, Lynn Dobson and Greg Wooldridge, Adrian Killam, and the George Huntington family.